Good afternoon. This is Kathleen Drew, Chair of the, what am I chair of? No. The Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council. My apologies for the technical difficulties here. We'll try and get everything into order. And as we begin, Ms. Grantham, will you call the roll?
Certainly, Chair Drew. Department of Commerce,
Elizabeth Osborne, present.
Department of Ecology,
Eli Levitt, present.
Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Natural Resources,
Lena Young, present.
Utilities and Transportation Commission,
Stacy Brewster, present.
Local Government and Optional State Agencies. For Horse Heaven, we have Benton County, Ed Brost. I know I saw Mr. Brost online. If you are online, please press #6 or *6. You might have gotten muted. I will move on for now. For Badger Mountain, for Douglas County, Jordan Julio.
Jordan Julio, present.
For the Watoma Solar Project for Benton County, Dave Sharp.
Dave Sharp, present.
Washington State Department of Transportation, Paul Gonseth.
Paul Gonseth, present.
Hop Hill Solar for Benton County, Paul Crouppen.
Paul Crouppen, present.
For the Character Solar for Klickitat County, Matt Childs.
Matt Childs, present.
For Wallowa Gap for Benton County, Adam File. And I will circle back for Benton County for Horse Heaven. Mr. Brost, were you able to unmute yourself?
I hope so.
We can hear you.
This is it. Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
super.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving down to Assistant Attorney Generals, John Thompson,
Present.
Jenna Slocum,
Present.
Zach Packer, Administrative Law Judges, Adam Torum.
Hi, this is Judge Torum. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Laura Bradley,
Judge Bradley, present.
Dan Gerard, and Travis Dupree. Moving on to FSEC staff, I will be calling those who may be anticipated to speak today. Sonia Bumpus,
Sonia Bumpus, present.
Amy Hofgemeyer,
Present.
Amy Moon,
Amy Moon, present.
Sarah Randolph,
Present.
Sean Green,
Present.
Lance Caputo,
Present.
John Barnes,
Present.
Joanne Snarsky,
Present.
and Zia Ahmed. Moving on to operational updates. Kittitas Valley Wind Project,
Jared Cassidy, present.
Wild Horse Wind Power Project, Grays Harbor Energy Center,
Chris Sharon's present.
Chehalis Generation Facility,
Jeremy Smith, present.
Columbia Generating Station,
Katie Hall, present.
Columbia Solar,
Thomas Cushing, present.
and Goose Prairie Solar.
Patrick McNellis, present.
And then do we have anyone present for the Council for the Environment?
Yes, this is Bill Sherman. I'm pinch hitting today for Yuri Coral and Sarah Reineveld.
Thank you. Chair, we have a quorum for all of the councils. Thank you.
Thank you. Council, in front of us, we have the proposed agenda. Is there a motion to adopt the proposed agenda?
Lena Young, so moved.
Second?
Stacy Brewster, second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? The minutes are, the agenda is approved. Moving on to the meeting minutes. You have in front of you the June 20th, 2024 monthly council meeting minutes. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
Elizabeth Osborne, so moved.
Thanks. Second.
Stacy Brewster, second.
Thanks. I have two edits, changes to the minutes. One is on page 45, line 24. The word habit should be habitat. And on page 47, line 25, the word the, T-H-E-E, should be tree. All those in favor of approving the minutes as amended, please say aye.
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 Opposed? The minutes are approved as amended. Moving on to our operational updates. Kittitas Valley Wind Project, Mr. Cassidy.
Good afternoon, Chair Drew, FSEC Council and staff. This is Jared Cassidy with the EDP Renewables for Kittitas Valley Wind Power Project. We had nothing non-routine to report for the period.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wild Horse Wind Power Project, Ms. Randolph.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Drew and council members. For the record, this is Sarah Randolph, Site Specialist for Wild Horse. The facility update is provided in your packet. There were no non-routine updates to report.
Thank you. Moving on to Chehalis Generation Facility, Mr. Smith.
Good afternoon, Chair Drew, council members, and staff. This is Jeremy Smith, the operations manager representing the Chehalis Generation Facility. I do not have anything non-routine to note for the month of June.
Thank you. Grace Harbor Energy Center, Mr. Sharon.
Good afternoon, Chair Drew, council members, and FSEC staff. This is Chris Sharon, plant manager from Grace Harbor Energy Center. For the month of June, the only non-routine item we had to have to report is that we did, or Grace Harbor Energy Center made FSEC staff aware of 3 emission exceedances during startups following our hot gas path inspection or major gas turbine work, and upgrades during our annual maintenance outage. Believe the issues other than all but the third event have been resolved. The third event was just CO on a startup shutdown limit of 500 pounds was exceeded. So Grace Harbor Energy Center is currently working with the gas turbine equipment manufacturer to determine the cause of these emissions events and ensure a resolution.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Go ahead.
This is Sarah Randolph. We had one other update.
Yes.
The EPA has reviewed the air operating permit or the AOP and has no objections. The council action to vote on the issuance of the permit was open for public comment and none were received. Staff recommends that the council vote to issuance the amended AOP. There are no other updates.
Okay. So we go ahead and make a motion to approve the Title V AOP for the Grace Harbor project.
Can I just pause for a moment?
Go ahead, Eli.
Yeah, just a quick question to make sure. So there were no public comments, but I also want to make sure that no members of the community or public asked for a public hearing. Is that correct? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Young?
Lenny Young, so moved.
Thank you. Second.
Stacy Brewster, second.
Are there any comments or questions? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. And thank you, staff, for all of your work on this as well. Moving on to Columbia Solar. Operational update, Mr. Cushing.
Good afternoon, Chair Drew, council members, FSEC staff. This is Thomas Cushing speaking on behalf of Columbia Solar. There are no non-routine updates to report.
Thank you. Columbia Generating Station, Ms. Hall, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Good afternoon, Chair Drew, council members, and FSEC staff. This is Katie Hall speaking on behalf of Columbia Generating Station and Washington Nuclear Project 1 and 4. There are no non-routine items to report for either Columbia Generating Station or the Washington Nuclear Project 1 and 4, which is also commonly known as the Industrial Development Complex. Thank you.
Thank you. Goose Prairie Solar. Patrick, I didn't catch your last name.
Patrick McNellis. I'm filling in for Jacob Christ.
Thank you.
And good afternoon, FSEC staff and council. Project is on schedule. Upcoming milestones are a 90-day soak. That's TBD when it's going to start. Goose Prairie is considered mechanically complete. On or around September 30th, we'll get sign off from utility for COD. All major scope items are complete. Cleanup items are current. Punch list items are completed. Hot commissioning and BPA testing remains. O&M site certificate deliverables in draft with Brookfield and O&M from Tetra Tech. For environmental compliance, no discharge in the site reported in June. Frequent monitoring is occurring through WSP with no findings reported for June, other than some filter socks that needed replaced. Current upcoming projects. The O&M office building permit has been submitted to Yakima County with FSEC on copy. And currently we're preparing for a transition to Brookfield operations, and a new contact list is in draft and will be provided as soon as possible.
Thank you.
And no further updates. Thank you.
High Top and Ostria, Ms. Randolph.
Thank you, Chair Drew, council members. For the record, this is Sarah Randolph, Site Specialist for High Top and Ostria. FSEC staff are continuing to work with the certificate holder and our contractors to review and refine pre-construction plans. In particular, staff are coordinating with the certificate holder on final revisions to the initial site restoration plan, or the ISRP, which will come to the council for review for the August council meeting and approval once fully refined. There are no further updates at this time.
Thank you. And again, that's for the Ostria project?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Badger Mountain project update, Ms. Snarsky.
Thank you, Chair Drew, and good afternoon, council members. For the record, this is Joanne Snarsky, the siting specialist for Badger Mountain Solar. On June 27th, FSEC received a formal request from the Avangrid Renewables, the applicant, to place all project activities on hold for the next 2 to 3 months. As you will see in your council packet, they stated that they intend to reevaluate public comments, including from project landowners and affected tribal nations. This request has paused the development of the draft environmental impact statement, wetlands characterization, and the cultural resources survey. I can answer any questions.
Thank you. So we were in the midst of a cultural resources survey, so we're stopping it midstream.
Good.
How much more work was left to be done on that?
I would say approximately 2/3 to half
Was left.
was remaining, correct.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from council members? Thank you. Moving on to Watoma Solar project update, Mr. Caputo.
Am I coming through? Very good. Thank you, Chair Drew and council members. On June 9th, 2022, Interject Renewable Development USA, LLC, submitted its application for site certification for the Watoma Solar Energy Project to the council for our review and your recommendation to the governor. The council convened its land use consistency hearing on August 8, 2022. On November 15, 2022, the council issued its final order of project inconsistent with land use regulations and set the matter for adjudication. Since the council found the project inconsistent with the county's land use provisions, an adjudicated proceeding must be held to determine if the council should recommend to the governor preemption of the county's land use provisions and site the facility. Because the FSEC SEPA responsible official issued a mitigated determination of non-significance for this project in May of this year, the adjudication can and has been limited to the issues surrounding land use pursuant to RCW 8050-090, Section 4, subsection B. A pre-hearing conference was notified on July 2nd and is scheduled for next week on July 22nd. May I answer any questions?
Are there any questions for Mr. Caputo? Thank you. Hop Hill Solar Project, Mr. Barnes.
Thank you, Chair Drew and council members. For the record, this is John Barnes, FSEC staff for the Hop Hill application. Work is continuing with the applicant to complete studies and reports needed to make a SEPA determination. We continue to coordinate and review the application with our contractor, contracted agencies, and tribal governments. Are there any questions?
Do I remember correctly that it is Hop Hill Solar that was looking at perhaps an addition to the application?
That is correct.
Okay. Just to remind everyone. Okay, thank you.
To clarify, Chair Drew, that has been informally communicated to staff, but we have not seen anything formally submitted yet.
Okay, thank you. Carriger Solar, Ms. Snarsky.
Thank you, Chair Drew. Again, this is Joanne Snarsky, the siting specialist for Carriger Solar. FSEC staff have been discussing the proposed mitigation in the revised visual impacts assessment provided to us by the applicant. Staff believe the applicant's mitigation proposal will reduce significant impacts to visual aesthetics. We anticipate the final revised visual impact assessment to be provided this week. It will then be posted on the Carriger website. Additionally, FSEC staff received final approval of the Cultural Resource Survey report from the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation and the Yakama Nation Cultural Resources Program. The next step for us is to complete the final SEPA determination, or excuse me, the next step in determining this final SEPA determination is for us to receive the traditional cultural property study that we've contracted with directly with the Yakama Nation's Cultural Resources Program. We expect this work to be completed in December 2024.
So we will wait for the conclusion of that study before
the final SEPA
the
determination.
final SEPA determination.
If I could jump in again, for the record, this is Amy Hofgemeyer. If the council will recall, when the applicant submitted an extension request letter, they requested an extension to allow for the completion of the study and then some additional time for discussions with the Yakama Nation, depending on the findings of that study, to identify mitigation.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to Wallula Gap project update, Mr. Barnes.
Thank you, Chair Drew and council members. For the record, this is John Barnes, FSEC staff for the Wallula Gap application. Staff has developed and sent on July 2nd, 2024, data request number 1. Staff are continuing to review the application with our contractor, contracted agencies, and tribal governments. Are there any questions?
Any questions? Thank you. Whistling Ridge, Mr. Caputo.
Thank you, Chair Drew and council members. In September 2023, FSEC received 2 petitions from Twin Creek Timber, LLC, regarding the Whistling Ridge Energy Project. The first petition seeks approval to transfer ownership of the site certification agreement from SDS Lumber to Twin Creek Timber. The second petition seeks an approval to extend the expiration date of the site certification agreement until November of 2026. Last month, the council directed staff to prepare a draft order for consideration at today's meeting. It is included in your information packets. The public was notified of pending council action on this project. One comment was received from the Friends of the Columbia Gorge. Based upon this comment, some edits are proposed for council consideration. Edits included corrections of the spelling of names, citations of applicable rules, and rewording of sentences to provide clarity. There is a red-line copy of the order in your packets. I will now quickly go through the proposed changes individually. On page 1 of the order, some edits are proposed to add clarity to the ownership of the company and correct the spelling of Mr. Sperado's name. Corrections to the spelling of his name are carried throughout the document. On page 2, it contains an additional grammatical correction removing the possessive from TCT. Page 3 corrected a citation to refer to the entirety of the section of the Washington Administrative Code, as well as a minor edit for readability. Page 5 contains in the footnote a correction of the characterization of the position of Friends of the Gorge. Staff request the council approve the order as amended. May I answer any questions?
Any questions for Mr. Caputo? Council members, this is an issue which we discussed at last meeting and held the public hearings as well. Is there a motion to approve the order which denies the request for approval of transfer of control and for an extension of site certification's expiration date, and declares the SCA expired, and denies as moot the Friends of the Columbia Gorges petition for an adjudicative proceeding on TCT's transfer and extension request? Is there a motion to approve?
Stacy Brewster, so moved.
Eli Levitt, second.
Thank you. Discussion? I think we did talk about this quite a bit at the last meeting, and the council unanimously was thinking at that point in time that the company did not meet the requirements for the approval of transfer of control and therefore an extension of the site certification. This is all laid out in the motion, in the council order. So approving the order, I should change the motion if you all agree that we are approving an order, number 893. All those in favor of Council Order 893, please say aye.
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 Aye. All those opposed? The order is approved. Thank you. We are now moving on to Horse Heaven Wind Farm. Project update. For those council members who are not present, if you could turn on your cameras so that when we have questions or we have discussion, I can better see when you are interested in making a comment. Mr. Brost, I don't know if you're able to, but we will keep track of you. Okay. Project update. Ms. Moon.
Good afternoon, Council Chair Drew and FSEC council members. For the record, this is Amy Moon reporting on the Horse Heaven Wind Project. FSEC staff continue to address feedback and comments provided by the Governor's Office and the FSEC Council on the Horse Heaven Recommendation Report. Sean Green, FSEC staff, has prepared a slide presentation in response to council questions and requests stemming from the June 20th council meeting. And I'm just going to introduce Sean. Sean, your turn.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, that looks like it's displaying. So as Amy mentioned at the previous council meeting, the council directed staff to identify mitigation alternatives in relation to mitigation options that were included within the draft site certification agreement that were identified by the governor's office as potentially reducing the production potential. Are we okay? Okay. So following that guidance, staff have identified several mitigation alternatives to replace, supplement, or pull back on the mitigation measures that were identified as having that potential of reducing production potential of the project. To begin with, we're going to go through several resource areas that were affected in a mitigative sense from the SCA regarding project impacts. The first of which is priority habitat. As a brief on non-exclusion mitigation measures that were included within the FEIS and subsequently incorporated into the SCA, there were several, including vegetation 1, which required that tree removal be avoided where possible and mitigated where necessary. Vegetation 4, which required an as-built report and revegetation monitoring to ensure success of revegetation and shrub step restoration. Vegetation 7, which required the preparation and execution of a detailed site restoration plan and revegetation plan, which again encompassed priority habitat. And habitat 5 and 8, which outlined the process through which an assessment of indirect habitat loss and alteration would take place, and outlined how compensatory mitigation would be developed. All of these measures and any other measures outlined in this presentation are included in their full text within your council packet. So for priority habitat, the draft SCA measure that was identified as potentially reducing energy production potential of the project was vegetation 10. This was a measure that was crafted by the council following the publication of the final environmental impact statement, and in essence prohibited the siting of solar arrays on rabbit brush shrubland or WDFW designated priority habitat types, of which the only one on site would be shrub step for this project. The result of this measure, if implemented, would reduce the proposed solar siting area. And as a reminder, that is the total area in which all solar arrays could be sited, but the final footprint of the solar arrays would not encompass the entire solar siting area. Approximately 5,200 acres of solar arrays are proposed by the applicant to be sited, and of those 75 acres, or about 1.5%, would be excluded from siting on their current footprint by this measure. Though it should be noted that there is the option for the applicant to relocate prohibited solar arrays to a different area of the solar siting area where they would not impact these habitat types. In regards to the alternatives proposed by staff, what you see on the screen are essentially the options: either eliminating vegetation 10 and allowing for siting on these areas with the other measures that were included in the final environmental impact statement and draft SCA, which are inclusive of applicant commitments to implement compensatory mitigation for any impacts to designated habitat types, or retaining the language from the draft SEA, which would continue to exclude approximately 10% of the solar siting area and 1.5% of the proposed solar footprint.
Mr. Brost? Or I'm sorry, who has the hand raised? Oh, that's
Chair Drew,
Lenny.
this is Lenny Young.
Hi.
Could you clarify? I think you characterized what we're looking at as staff proposals. Are these in fact, or excuse me, staff recommendations? Are these staff recommendations, or are these just possibilities that staff is sharing with the council?
So, Ms. Bumpus, would you like to take that question?
Yes, for the record, this is Sonia Bumpus. The PowerPoint presentation revisits what was in the FEIS and what was in the draft site certification agreement sent to the governor. And in some cases, we have offered an alternative to those for discussion by the council. Vegetation 10 does not have another option that we created for you to consider. We really just wanted to show here the difference between what the measures in the FEIS for priority habitat were versus those measures in addition to Veg 10, which was drafted by the council. This is, I'll just add that this isn't a measure that in the staff's view, we found to have a significant difference in the overall output of the project. As Mr. Green mentioned, there is the possibility of relocation, even with Veg 10 in place. And so we really didn't, ultimately didn't really see that this was one that had a substantial impact on the build out. But yes, it does have some role in affecting the potential build out.
Yeah, understood. I think I heard Mr. Green, though, refer to this as a staff recommendation. And I just was looking for clarity on whether what we're being presented this afternoon is analysis without a recommendation, or in fact is a staff recommendation.
Yeah, you are correct. These are not intended to be staff recommendations. If I use that terminology, that was incorrect. We went back and reviewed resource areas where the council had identified mitigation beyond those in the FEIS, which essentially operates as the staff recommendation, and tried to identify alternatives for the council's consideration at this meeting that are options for you to discuss. The final versions of these mitigation, including their retaining them as written in the SEA, removing them, or adding on to them, is a determination that will be made by the council and can extend beyond the options presented on your screen right now.
Understood. Thank you for clarifying.
Mr. Young, what I'm looking for today is the views from the council on each of these areas to perhaps have then at the conclusion of our discussion, something we would direct the staff to draft for the August meeting. So for example, as I look at Veg 10, I think that this does not affect the output. I think it's a common sense approach. I think it retains vegetation in priority areas. And for me, I guess I would ask if the council is comfortable retaining that. Are there any views?
This is Stacy Brewster. I'll agree with you on that. I think that the impact is small. The benefits for retaining that habitat is high and worthy of keeping in place.
Anyone would like to object, please say so. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next slide. Okay. We can come back to it if people have questions. We just have a lot more material to get through. So, and we can have a motion if the council desires to do so at the end, and we can discuss everything in that. Okay, thank you.
Okay. The next resource area that was related to potential mitigation measures that would reduce the production and energy potential of the project was wildlife movement corridors. There were several mitigation measures in the FEIS that were incorporated into the SCA that did not deal with exclusion of project components that still mitigated for this resource, including Wildlife 6, which required maintenance of a road mortality database and enforced adaptive management based on the results of that database data collection. Habitat 2, which required minimization of transmission lines crossing canyons and draws to reduce potential wildlife movement barriers. And Habitat 7, which required that all project roadways be removed during decommissioning to restore pre-project levels of wildlife movement. The exclusion mitigation measure that mitigated for impacts to this resource was Habitat 1. The FEIS version of this measure required that all project components be located within medium or above wildlife linkage corridors be avoided to the extent feasible. And if they were sited within those medium or above linkage corridors, they must be accompanied by a corridor mitigation plan, which includes a number of measures, including adjacent habitat improvements, features to accommodate passage, such as culverts, post-construction monitoring, and restoration. The draft SCA version of the measure prohibited the siting of primary project components, specifically turbines, solars, and BESS, within medium or above linkage corridors, and prohibited the siting of secondary project components, such as roads and transmission lines, in higher above linkage corridors, unless co-located with existing infrastructure. And the SCA version maintained the FEIS corridor mitigation plan for all medium or all secondary components sited within medium or above linkage corridors. The result of implementation of the draft SCA version of this mitigation would see approximately a 13.5% reduction in the number of turbines based on where they're currently proposed within the project area, as well as a 6% reduction in the proposed solar siting area, though none of the currently proposed solar footprint would be affected. There's also the matter of a 230 kilovolt intertie transmission line that is proposed, that the applicant has requested the option of construction to connect their eastern substation and western substation. At 3 points along its route, this line would cross areas of higher above linkage corridors and be precluded from being sited there. So additional engineering redesign would be necessary for about 3.5 miles of that 19+ mile intertie line.
Mr. Green, a couple of questions for you. First of all, when you look back at the FEIS language, and I know it's just summarized here, and for the council members, there is something that is in the packet which you can't see there, but can we maybe put it on the screen? The Habitat 1, is that
Yes,
the one?
I can.
I think that would be very good. So in other projects that have come recently to FSEC, we've had a great deal of cooperation from applicants to identify a wildlife corridor through the project, if that was raised as a concern. When I read this, that is in the FEIS, and when you read it, do you read it saying there must be a wildlife movement corridor through the project?
So the FEIS version is specific to modeled wildlife movement corridors by the Washington Wildlife Habitat Connectivity Working Group. It is less a requirement that a wildlife movement corridor be installed in the project area and more a requirement that project components seek to avoid being placed in already identified wildlife movement corridors, if that makes sense.
But to the extent feasible.
Correct.
So how do we ensure in the FEIS measure that there will be future wildlife movement through the project?
That is done through the development of the corridor mitigation plan. And you can see on your screen, there are a number of different avenues that the applicant could work with FSEC and WDFW to identify which and in what level would be most effective at retaining available wildlife movement areas, following the potential for project components to adversely impact the modeled wildlife movement corridors. And those can include things like improvement of habitat adjacent to those model corridors, or installing movement infrastructure within the project, such as open bottom culverts that allow for easier wildlife movement in concert with the installation of project components.
Are there any other questions or comments from council members?
I have one, if you can hear me.
Mr. Brost?
Question on what's feasible versus not. Who defines what that is? Is there a definition of what is feasible?
There is not a definition of what is feasible. That would be a process that FSEC would go through with the applicant to determine which project components were necessary for an effective build out of the project, and which could potentially be eliminated if they were not critical.
But in addition to FSEC, when you say FSEC, we do have the PTAG, and we have Fish and Wildlife, Department of Fish and Wildlife, who will also be part of this process, and perhaps the tribe, the Yakima tribe as well.
Yes, this is a measure that would encompass the PTAG and subsequently the TAC as part of the development of the mitigation plan and the development of the performance standards and adaptive mitigation throughout the life of the project. So it would incorporate guidance from a number of state agencies and potentially affected tribes should they wish to be members of the PTAG and the TAC.
There's one more question. Does the community or the county have some input in that? If they have some?
We have had TACs on previous projects that have included county representatives. The exact membership of the PTAG and TAC for this project have not been defined as of yet.
Certainly, I would think that if they were interested, they would be able to participate. Mr. Young?
Yeah, I have a concern that in and of itself, removing this provision of the original SCA would allow the restoration of up to 30 turbines and 3.4 miles of 230 kV transmission line to the project, and that this would increase the project's already significant impacts on Yakima Nation traditional cultural properties.
Thank you. Are there other comments as to the council's view of retaining this as it is in the draft SCA, returning perhaps to the FEIS language? To me, it does, and I hear Mr. Young, I do think that if there are ways, as we're talking just about, I mean, we can also talk about tribal cultural properties. I'm really walking through this to perhaps identify what mitigation goes with which impact. And as a wildlife corridor impact, personally, I would be comfortable with the FEIS language. I do think the fact that it's in the middle of the project and there's potential for impact to a optional intertie transmission line, that the outcome I would be looking for in this would be that there is able to be wildlife movement throughout the project after the project is completed. Any other comments?
This is Stacy Brewster. With the components that we're discussing, which tend to be porous and allow for some movement, I see where you're coming from and I get your point. I think initially identified and what we're trying to move away from is the compounding impacts. And I think initially we looked at that corridor because it had those turbines had multiple impacts. So in terms of movement, it seems to me the FEIS conditions are probably adequate, not ideal, as I think we would like to avoid those impacts entirely. But if we're talking about movement, it seems to me the FEIS mitigation is probably sufficient. I would be interested in hearing the thoughts on our Fish and Wildlife Council member. Unfortunately, he's not with us today.
Yes, he's not able to be here, but what we're talking about, I think, is asking the staff to draft something, and we're not voting on it. So we have time to consider it and look at comments, and then perhaps come back in August just to have something in front of us to discuss. Any other comments? Okay, let's move on to the next issue.
Okay. The next resource is the Ferruginous hawk. There are several non-exclusion mitigation measures from the FEIS that were incorporated into the SCA, including Wildlife One, which implements a mortality monitoring program and adaptive management strategy for all avian species, inclusive of the Ferruginous hawk. And that's a fairly lengthy measure, and it's available again in that handout. There's also Wildlife 8, which prohibits the sighting of turbines within a quarter mile of all documented raptor nests, inclusive of the Ferruginous hawk. Currently, this would exclude 3 of the 222 option 1 turbines, or about 1%, or 1 of the 147 option 2 turbines, just under 1%. And the third measure is Wildlife 9, which requires that vegetation clearing and grubbing during the Ferruginous hawk during all avian species breeding periods, inclusive of the Ferruginous hawk, be avoided where feasible and mitigated for if necessary. And the exclusion measure is there we go. Okay, I don't know why my bottom bar is showing, but the FEIS version of Species 5 prohibits the sighting of project components within 2 miles of a documented Ferruginous hawk where that nesting site is still available and where foraging habitat is viable. For any components sited within 2 miles of an unavailable or non-viable Pharugis hawk nest, a Pharugis hawk mitigation and management plan would be required, which includes habitat loss offsets, turbine curtailment, active nest disturbance avoidance, and pre and post construction monitoring, as well as others. And again, that is a fairly lengthy measure and it's available in your handout. For all versions of species 5, wildlife 1, wildlife 8, and wildlife 9 from the previous slide would still apply. The FEIS version would exclude anywhere between 0 and about 48% of the project proposed turbines. The exact number would be determined after the process of identifying which nests are available and viable. The range for excluded solar siting area is 0 to 30%, and the range of excluded current proposed solar footprint would be 0 to 12%. It would also potentially exclude up to one of the 3 proposed BESS sites, though it should be noted that the SCA only allows for a maximum of 2 BESSes within the project area. The draft SCA version of species 5 implements a hard buffer on all documented Pharugis hawk nests of 2 miles, not allowing any turbines to be sited within that 2-mile buffer. It also applies a half-mile buffer to all documented Pharugis hawk nests for solar arrays and BESS. It continues the requirement for a Pharugis hawk mitigation and management plan for any components sited within 2 miles of a documented nest. This measure would exclude approximately 48% of the project turbines, just under 10% of the proposed solar siting area, and about 4% of the current proposed solar footprint. A third option, which would be, which is not from the FEIS or the SCA, but it has been developed by staff as something that could potentially address the council's concerns about impacts to this resource, would be a version of the draft SCA mitigation, but replacing the 2-mile buffer with a 0.6-mile buffer or 1-kilometer buffer. This buffer was adapted after review of the 2004 WDFW seasonal disturbance guidelines for active Pharugis hawk nests. So it should be made clear that this guidance is not a direct one-to-one comparison with how we're using it here, but it is something that WDFW has published on the record regarding what active projects should, the distance to which active projects should avoid disturbing active Pharugis hawk nests. This measure would prohibit the siting of all primary project components, so turbines, solar, and BESS within 0.6 miles of a documented Pharugis hawk nest, and still require that any components sited within 2 miles, again, require a Pharugis hawk mitigation and management plan. This option, if implemented as written here, would exclude about 5.5% of the proposed turbines, 12% of the proposed solar siting area, or about 6% of the current proposed solar footprint. And again, these are options given to the council for consideration. These are not the only options available to the council if they wish to develop their own.
Mr. Young?
Yeah, I have 2 comments here, and the first is that I do not believe that it is appropriate scientifically to extrapolate a seasonal activity buffer, in this case, 1 kilometer, to a habitat protection buffer. Those are 2 different concepts, if you will, that address different aspects of the species' life history. So I don't believe that the extrapolation of the activity buffer to a habitat protection buffer is appropriate. And then similarly, as with Habitat 1, I have great concern that restoring 107 turbines to the landscape would increase the project footprint and would have a big impact on Yakima Nation traditional cultural properties.
Are there other questions or comments from council members? So I will ask a question. So in addition to the 1 kilometer buffer, there would still be not just, would it just be seasonal curtailment? Would it require, if there are active nests before construction, to not have those turbines constructed?
So any nest that would be identified up to the start of construction would be afforded the same buffer as any other documented nest based on how this is written now. As for seasonal curtailment, as the third option is written, that would apply for any turbines constructed within 2 miles of a documented nest. Both of those truths as this is written now could be altered by the council if you desire.
If we look at the FEIS has components prohibited within 2 miles of documented ferruginous hawk nests where nesting site is available and foraging habitat is viable. We don't have the information of that yet. When would you expect that? Would you expect that that information would be required before the construction plan is completed?
Yes, prior to construction, FSEC, the PTAG, and the applicant would go through the process of identifying which nests are available, which nesting sites are available, and which documented ferruginous hawk nests have viable foraging habitat within that 2 mile buffer. For nests that meet both of those selection criteria, they would be afforded that 2 mile buffer based on the FEIS version. Nests that do not meet one or both of the criteria would allow project components within the buffer so long as they are accompanied by a mitigation and management plan, which includes a number of things, perhaps most importantly, a seasonal curtailment plan. But that would all be completed prior to the start of construction.
And that would be based on available nests where foraging habitat is viable, not necessarily actual nesting of a hawk.
Yes, so if there is an active nest, it would automatically be determined that the nesting site is available and the habitat is viable. So any active nest would immediately be given that buffer based on the FEIS version.
Questions or comments or thoughts from council members?
This is Stacy Brewster. Initially, my thought on the new option is that it's based on 20-year-old recommendations and prior to the listing of the ferruginous hawk as endangered. So I would hope that we could get some more current science and recommendations from Fish and Wildlife on which to base any consideration we might make. I know that may not be the case. And I'm inclined to put the strictest protections around ferruginous hawks at this point. That is my leaning at the moment. I guess there's too many questions as to identifying nests and their viability and habitat for me at the moment.
And I would say that the 2 mile buffer outlined within the FEIS is based on the most current recommendation from WDFW staff. They have identified that as the home range of the ferruginous hawk.
Other comments?
Well,
go ahead.
This is Eli Levitt. I think I just have one or two. One is that, it's kind of an exercise in lumping and splitting, and I think the direction we've gotten from the governor's office is to try to look at the impacts individually and choose which option fits best. So just, I guess, maybe a reminder that we're trying to think about each one individually and think about the option that works best for each of us as individuals and the council. The other thing for me is thinking about the FEIS and what it says. It seems like a lot of the numbers would really come down to how the technical group and the council would define available and viable. And so it's a little bit difficult to vote on an option that has such a wide range of options. So I guess that's just an observation for me.
I do think that for the overall consideration, and for me, I'm speaking for myself, that we have a real challenge in that we very much want to protect the home territory of the ferruginous hawk. But we also don't have the future knowledge of whether it will be there or not. And that is really a very, very difficult challenge for us to come to terms with. I think having a hard buffer less than the 2 miles makes sense for that reason. I think the 1 kilometer is the other hard buffer that we have in the record. So again, you asked about information. This is the one that is in the record. And again, I went back and I listened to the adjudication and to listened to particularly Don McIvers. There was a lot of experts and we got a lot of good information. But talking about both the risk and then the application of adaptive management, which is why if the ferruginous hawk is one goal, but it's not our only goal. And so trying to balance these two in a way that's protective, I think one way of doing that could be to have a short, less than 2 mile buffer with the FEIS adaptive management. So that is the way I'm looking at it, not assurance, but trying to balance the need for clean energy and the potential impact for an endangered species. I mean, if it is available, if the species does come to the site, I think we have hard stops. We also have the ability with, and that could include, if the turbines are constructed, then seasonal curtailment. But with the FEIS, we also have the potential to look at the most viable habitat, not ourselves, but our staff and associates, Fish and Wildlife, tribal members if they wish to, others, to identify those viable, most viable areas and have additional protection. So that's why, I guess, that's where I'm leaning at this point in time. Other questions from council members? Comments? Discussion?
Can I pose a question?
Would you like to vote on that now or as a part of a motion in the end? If you're making the motion, we can look for a vote right now.
I didn't have a motion to make. I was going to ask a question about the buffer zones. Is it a norm that the buffers for wind and solar are the same? From the non-scientific guy, it seems to me that the wind would have a larger buffer than the solar would, but it sounds like they're the same here. Am I correct on that, or do I have that?
The FEIS version and the third option there do have the same buffer areas for wind and solar. The draft SCA version had different buffers for the two component types. If the council wants to identify preferred buffers for the component types, we can work those into final language.
I don't know what the purpose of a 1 kilometer buffer from solar and BESS has.
So the primary impact that solar and BESS construction would have on the Pharrugian hawk is the denial of available foraging habitat. If those nests were ever occupied, the home range is the area within 2 miles. And while those components may not be sited on ideal foraging habitat, there may be some foraging activity of that species within that area. The primary impact that turbine construction would have is direct mortality via strike. So all three types of components have an impact. They're just of differing types and degree.
And would you say that with Veg 10, is the project reduction listed in the draft SCA, the right column, overlap? Maybe that's unfair to ask you.
No, so it's fine. The third option would only exclude areas of the solar siting area within the east solar array. That is the same area that is addressed by Veg 10. So that 75-acre area of the solar footprint excluded by Veg 10 would also be excluded by this measure, the third option, or honestly, any three of these options. The two western solar arrays are outside of the 2 mile buffer of any identified nest, so they would not be affected by this measure in any format.
Okay, any other questions? Let's move on to the traditional, but the next slide, I'll just say.
Okay. Okay, the next resource area is cultural resources. There are two non-exclusion measures in the FEIS and SCA. The first is Cultural Resources 1, which requires that the applicant maintain ongoing engagement with affected tribes and, where appropriate, implement relevant and effective mitigation measures that may be developed as part of that engagement. The second is Cultural Resources 2, which outlines the specific DAP permit, Department of Archaeological and Historic Preservation permitting and or avoidance buffers required for specifically identified archaeological and architectural resources of a historic and or cultural nature, which can include TCPs. All of these identified resources that could be impacted by the project have been outlined within that measure in the table that is attached to it in your handout. Originally, the SCA version of Species 5 was developed to identify compounding impacts, including impacts to traditional cultural properties, in an effort to split up the mitigation to specifically address resource areas. Staff have identified two potential mitigation options that the council can consider for inclusion in the final version of the SCA or the final draft of the SCA. Both of these are new to this point, but they do draw on the existing record. On March 2nd of 2021, the Yakima Nation identified Weber Canyon as an area of particular TCP concern for them. These two measures on the left impose a 0.5 mile buffer for turbines around Weber Canyon. On the right, it is a full 1 mile buffer around the maximum extent of Weber Canyon. The 0.5 mile buffer would eliminate 4 turbines from either option, about 2% of the project proposed turbines. The 1 mile buffer would exclude 17 option 1 turbines or 13 option 2 turbines for approximately 8% of the total proposed turbines.
And again, this is one letter. We're not saying this addresses the large extent of the Yakima Nation's concerns with this project, but this is a specific one which is in the actual project area that staff wanted to draw attention to for the council.
That is correct. The Yakima Nation has identified multiple TCPs within the project lease boundary and adjacent to it that would be impacted by project construction, and have indicated that all proposed project components would adversely impact TCPs. This one was proposed for inclusion here because it is specifically outlined in the record as an area where the Yakima Nation has identified particular concerns. Any reduction in the project footprint would have an associated reduction of impacts to TCPs.
Thank you. I understand you might actually have a map of this one.
Yes. So this is the option 1 turbines, and I have an associated map with option 2 turbines, but they are more or less the same. The purple outline is the maximum geographic extent of Weber Canyon. The black dots are, in the case of this map, option 1 turbines as currently proposed for siting. The yellow highlighted area would be a 0.5 mile buffer, with the orange being a full 1 mile buffer. And the number of turbines visible in this map are not exactly the same as what you saw on the slide, because some of these turbines have already been removed from the application proposal by applicant commitment. But the numbers in the previous slide that you saw are accurate.
Mr. Young.
Yeah, my concern here is I'm glad to appreciate seeing the concern for TCPs to the extent that they're maybe or associated with Weber Canyon. But I don't know whether a 0.5 mile buffer or a 1 mile buffer, I don't know to what extent that would provide necessary impact reduction in this area. And then in and of itself, as evidenced by all the input we've received from Yakima Nation in the 2 years subsequent to March 21, 3 years subsequent to March 21, this is a very, very limited reduction of impacts to Yakima Nation TCPs. If in fact it does provide impact reduction for a TCP at all. So concerned with the very small amount, the very limited scope of this, and not knowing whether what's proposed would provide meaningful protection or not.
Thank you. Other comments or questions?
This is Eli Levitt. I guess I would offer that was a challenge of a lot of the public comments we received across the board almost, is that specific individuals and groups did not tell us which mitigation measures would suffice for them, or how specific changes may help hinder or maintain their concerns. So, in some ways, as a council, with the exception of some of the more scientific mitigation measures, we're operating without a lot of detailed understanding for what would work for individuals or groups.
Mr. Young?
Yeah, I would just add that we have, again, multiple subsequent written communications from Yakima Nation post March 21 that do provide us some idea of the extent to which the project would need to be modified to avert impacts to Yakima Nation TCPs. We do have communications from Yakima Nation that do speak to that.
Thank you. That's true. And we also do have communications saying the SCA, which was proposed to the governor, was insufficient, as everybody well knows. Any other questions or comments here? Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the work on this. Next slide.
Yeah, so the final resource that we're going to go through in this presentation is public health and safety, specifically in relation to aerial firefighting. There is one non-exclusion measure in the FEIS and SCA that deals with this resource. That is Public Health and Safety 1, which requires that turbines be shut down in the event of a major wildfire occurring in an area where fire suppression aircraft may need access near the project. Staff have identified two potential options for the council to consider regarding this resource. Both are based on the perimeter of historic wildfires in the area of the project since 2000. The left would eliminate any turbines proposed within the perimeter of one or more of those fires, while the option on the right would provide that perimeter with a 0.25 mile buffer. That is proposed in consideration of DNR guidance that they provide all of their aerial firefighting craft with a quarter mile standoff buffer from turbines when in operation. So no turbines would be allowed to be sited within that standoff buffer of the perimeter of any historic fire since 2000. The elimination of, or the exclusion of turbines from the perimeters would eliminate about 1% of the proposed turbines, while adding that quarter mile buffer would exclude 3 to 5% of the proposed turbines. And the area of the project that these historic fires have taken place is generally the northwest ridge line of the lease boundary.
Do you also have a map of that?
I do. This is adapted from a map that was provided to the council during adjudication. The various colors are the perimeters of historic fires with the names of the fires written as well, while the black dots are option 1 turbines as currently proposed. You can see that, you see my cursor? Yes. These three are the three that would be within the perimeter, while the ones surrounding it are within the quarter mile buffer. And again, this is not a direct one-to-one comparison to the numbers that you saw on the slide, because some of these turbines have voluntarily been removed from the application by applicant commitment.
Thank you. Questions? Comments?
Just curious, firefighting is new to me. Is this, is the use of historic fires a common practice for delineating fire danger?
Bumpus?
My team is leaving me hanging here. For the record, this is Sonia Bumpus. I was just going to say that one thought that came to mind is that I think that this was, that rationale was some of the rationale that was used in the original recommendation.
Yeah, and I would say it's a fairly common practice to review the perimeters of historic fires to identify areas where topography or vegetation may limit the spread of fires in the future, and also to identify areas that are particularly fire prone. The reason that there have been so many fires in this area is the prevailing winds in the area do whip up the fire as they approach the ridgeline. And you can see this this bit here where it kind of goes south is Weber Canyon. And that is again a case where topography aids the spread of fire through the canyon area and limits its spread from the bottom of the canyon to the ridgeline above it.
And I would add one other thought to that, and that is that in thinking about the framework around SEPA, the State Environmental Policy Act, when you're identifying impacts, you also consider, you're considering significant adverse impacts, but you also consider the probability. And so I think that's also where you have some basis for considering historic fire activity at the site.
Thanks. Yeah, looking at the map, that makes sense. I was just curious if it was a practice.
And we did hear from DNR, Department of Natural Resources, about the specific distance that you have in option 2, correct?
Yes, that came from a DNR source where
DNR.
they indicated that they provide a quarter-mile buffer to all turbines as a standoff area for their aircraft.
So my view on this one specifically is that the mitigation option 2 is appropriate given what we heard about the concern for fire and the testimony from DNR. Oh, Mr. Young.
Yeah, just a couple of comments here. Absolutely, looking at historic fire patterns is valuable in determining or estimating future fire risk. But to point out the obvious, there is no hard guarantee that future fires would occur exactly where fires have occurred in the past. And then just pointing out, because I think I saw in a previous slide that there was a reference to having turbines stop operations, have the blades come to a halt during when aerial firefighting is ongoing. And I would just point out that the turbines, as tall vertical structures, present a hazard to aircraft operations, regardless of whether the blade is turning or not.
Oh, yes. I hear your point there. I think that's what the buffer of turbines, the quarter mile from those fire-prone areas. But as you said, that's no guarantee that's where the fire is going to be. So, understood.
This is Eli Levitt. Mr. Green, do you know to what degree some of these recommendations or mitigation measures, the Venn diagram overlap is between some of them? For example, does vegetation 10 overlap with this one or any of the other ones?
Vegetation 10 doesn't overlap with this one because that deals specifically with solar arrays placed on priority habitat. There is overlap between potentially overlap between this measure, species 5 dealing with ferruginous hawk, and the measure that we discussed just prior to this dealing with TCPs. Correct. Yes. Especially the northern half of Weber Canyon, the turbines proposed there would be excluded by any of those 3 measures. The southern half of Weber Canyon would be excluded by this measure and TCPs.
Are there other questions, other issues that the council would like to discuss? I have a draft proposal why don't would you become the chair of the meeting? And I'll make the motion.
Okay.
Rather than asking anyone else to do so. So I'm asking the council to direct the staff, the motion is to direct the staff to develop amendments to the amendments to the draft site certification agreement for consideration at August's meeting. I would like to have a map of the Venn diagram, as Eli put it, but a map that the council can look at that lays out these all these measures together. And so the motion is maintaining Veg 10. That's not an amendment. Eliminating the draft SCA prohibition of primary project components. I guess this is Habitat 1 wildlife movement corridors, and returning that to the FEIS language. For the ferruginous hawk to have a 1 kilometer buffer for all identified ferruginous hawk nests. Is that the correct language, Mr. Green?
Documented. would probably be-
Documented, thank you. And to include all of the language that was in the FEIS on species 5. To have a new mitigation option on traditional cultural properties of mitigation option 2 for prohibit turbines within 1 mile of Weber Canyon. And new mitigation option on aerial firefighting, option 2. Did I cover everything? Okay. Is there a second to my motion?
Eli Levitt, second.
Thank you. Is there discussion? Mr. Young?
I'll be voting against the motion, and I'd like to explain why. I do support retaining Veg 10, and I do support the last two pieces, although I view those last two pieces of having fairly limited utility. But I am opposed to the changes to Habitat 1 and Species 5. So I would be voting against the motion.
Thank you. Any other comments? Oh, I just took over the chair. Whoops, sorry. Ms. Brewster. That was for you to do.
Are there any comments or discussion? This is Stacy Brewster, just to seek a little bit of clarification on the adjustments to species 5. You discussed the third option with the kilometer buffer with the addition of the FEIS language that would prohibit a 2 miles around documented nests, where nesting site is available and habitat is viable. So this is a combination of the two, where documentation of viable nests and habitat would lead to a 2 mile buffer?
That is my understanding of what Chair Drew proposed.
Thanks. Are there any other comments? All those in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed?
Nay.
The ayes have it.
Yes. Thank you. Would you like me to take the?
Please take
over. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you all. That was a lot of information to review and think about. And again, we will come back again, having that drafted for discussion and votes in August. Back to the agenda. Okay. Next, we have the Golden Eye BESS battery storage system, new application. Mr. Ahmed.
Chair Drew, Mr. Ahmed is out of the office today, so I will be introducing the project to the council.
Ms. Hofgemeyer.
Thank you. As mentioned, for the record, my name is Amy Hofgemeyer. FSEC received an application for a standalone BESS project, GoldenEye BESS, proposed by the developer Tenaska, who I believe is on the line to introduce themselves. This is a BESS project that is located in Skagit County. One day I'll remember that. And on 16 acres of privately owned ag land. And I will ask if the developer is on the line to introduce themselves. It sounds like they may not be with us today. Staff are working on scheduling the informational meeting for the project, as well as the land use consistency hearing. And once those details are available, the council and the public will be notified.
And we will have a presentation from them at that meeting.
Correct.
Moving on to the cost allocation, Ms. Bumpus.
Good afternoon, Chair Drew and council members. For the record, this is Sonia Bumpus reporting on the non-direct cost allocation for Q1 fiscal year 2025. This covers July 1, 2024 through September 30, 2024. Quite a long list to get through here for the projects. Kittitas Valley Wind Power Project, 4%. Wild Horse, 4%. Columbia Generating Station, 20%. Columbia Solar, 4%. WNP1, 2%. Grays Harbor 1 and 2, 6%. Chehalis, 6%. Desert Claim Wind Power Project, 4%. Goose Prairie Solar Project, 4%. Horse Heaven Wind Farm Project, 11%. Badger Mountain adjusted to 0% given the pause. For High Top, 4%, Ostria, 4%, Watoma Solar, 7%, Hop Hill, 5%, Carriger Solar, 5%, Wallula Gap, 5%, and Goldeneye, our recent addition, 5%. And that concludes my update for the updated non-direct cost allocations.
With that, we conclude our agenda, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.